She walked into the hall with a quiet grace, her posture upright, movements slow but steady, carrying the kind of weight that only time and service can instill. The moment the doors creaked open and she stepped across the threshold, all eyes turned. Not because of who she was, but because of what she wore. Her uniform was old, unmistakably aged. The once crisp lines had long since faded. The stitching along the sleeves was loose, one of the shoulder seams fraying, and the metals that clung to her chest plate looked like they hadn't seen polish in years. There were gasps, stifled laughs, a few elbows nudging neighbors as whispers floated through the crowd. Who let her in? That can't be regulation. I bet she got that off eBay. The front row held a cluster of younger servicemen. Fresh-pressed uniforms, clean boots, shining badges. All of them watching with raised brows and amused smirks. One even pulled out his phone, pretending to check messages but actually recording a short clip. Just enough for a joke to go viral. The way they looked at her wasn't with curiosity or even confusion, it was judgment, harsh and fast, as if her presence in that space was an insult to the very walls around them. A young officer leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "Is this some kind of cosplay thing? This is a formal event." The other chuckled. "She looks like she's wearing her grandfather's uniform. Who shows up like that?" Her boots thudded gently against the polished floor as she made her way through the rows of neatly dressed attendees. There was no fanfare. No applause. No welcome. Just eyes trailing her every step, eyes that didn't see her, they saw only what they assumed. Someone near the back scoffed. Probably never even served. Stolen valor types show up at stuff like this all the time. Real vets don't wear that ragged crap. But she kept walking, her face unreadable. Calm. Weathered. She held no phone, no guest list, no paper in her hand, just a single, folded piece of cloth in her back pocket, worn with edges that looked like they'd been touched by sand, rain, and maybe even blood. As she reached a bench near the side wall, she stood for a moment, quietly scanning the room. Not to challenge anyone, not to seek recognition. Simply to observe. Her eyes paused briefly on a rustling flag in the corner. Then she sat. Across the room, a junior lieutenant shook his head. "It's almost disrespectful. Look at those boots. She didn't even shine them." Another agreed, loudly enough for a few others to hear, makes a mockery of what a uniform means. The rest of us earned ours. And so the murmurs continued. Even some of the older attendees gave side glances. A few frowned. One man crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, visibly uncomfortable. Everyone had something to say, under their breath, of course. But none approached her. None asked her name. None noticed how her fingers rested gently on the frayed hem of her sleeve, as if touching a memory no one else could see. The hall was decorated for a ceremony. Medals, plaques, certificates, and banners hanging proudly from the rafters. A celebration of legacy, of honor, of those who served with distinction. But somehow, in that space dedicated to remembrance, they had already forgotten how sacrifice wears different faces. The chatter began to shift from whispers to quiet disdain. One woman pulled a fellow officer aside and muttered, "Should we check credentials? I mean, just in case." Someone nearby snorted. If she did serve, it was probably in some clerical role. That uniform doesn't belong anywhere near combat history. The irony was thick. In a room full of people trained to observe, not one of them saw the subtle cues that told a different story. Not the slight limp she tried to hide. Not the darkened thread of her unit patch, half erased by time. Not the way her eyes flickered just once toward the exit, weighing whether this humiliation was worth enduring for whatever reason she came. Still, she stayed. She didn't flinch. She didn't fold under their stares. And yet the judgment continued, louder now, emboldened by assumption. She didn't speak. Not once. Not to explain herself, not to defend the uniform draped over her shoulders, and certainly not to answer the murmurs circling the room like vultures. Instead, she let silence be her shield. Where others might have lashed out or stormed away, she remained still, back straight, eyes forward, her breathing steady like someone trained to endure worse than words. The murmurs were thick now, their tones laced with mockery and disbelief, but she never acknowledged them. Her silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate. It was earned. As more guests arrived and filled the rows of neatly arranged chairs, many took the chance to glance her way again. She became the unspoken focal point of the gathering. Not for what she had done, but for how she looked. For what she wore. For how she didn't seem to belong. A man walked by her aisle, clearly one of the invited speakers. His uniform was crisp, medals aligned perfectly across his chest. As he passed, he gave her a brief, confused look, not hateful, not amused, just unsure of how someone so out of place had found her way here. He didn't speak either. He simply nodded to himself and moved on. But even the momentary glance of uncertainty was more grace than most had offered her since she walked in. A woman in a gray pantsuit leaned into a group gathered near the refreshment table and whispered just loud enough she must know people are staring. Why won't she say anything? Doesn't she care? But the woman in the uniform stayed seated. Hands folded on her lap. Shoulders relaxed but not slouched. She looked like someone who knew how to sit through tension, who had done so in war rooms, transport trucks, or maybe field hospitals filled with things no one ever talks about when they write about heroism. She didn't shrink from the attention. She just didn't rise to meet it either. That unnerved people more than they admitted. Because silence is powerful. Silence unsettles. Silence makes people project their own thoughts. And right now, they were projecting everything they feared and misunderstood about service, about sacrifice, about the idea that someone who looked so ordinary could carry a history deeper than their own. A younger cadet passed by and shot her a side glance, snickering to another behind him. She's probably waiting for someone to thank her for a war she Googled yesterday. The woman didn't move. She didn't scold. Didn't engage. Her eyes remained locked on the front of the hall where the podium stood, draped in military flags and framed by gold-fringed banners that read Honor, Integrity, Service. 3 words she likely knew too well. A man seated 2 rows behind her cleared his throat and leaned forward, perhaps trying to catch her attention. But when she didn't turn around, he leaned back and muttered, "She's ignoring everyone. Like she thinks she's above us or something." But it wasn't arrogance. It wasn't entitlement. It was discipline. It was the kind of restraint born in long deployments where speaking out could cost lives. The kind of emotional armor forged when words only made pain linger longer. This wasn't a woman trying to prove something. This was a soldier who had nothing to prove. Even the ushers weren't quite sure what to do. One whispered to another, "Should we double-check the guest list?" "I don't know. She hasn't caused any problems." "Yeah, but she's just sitting there. Just sitting." That's all she had done. And somehow it had rattled nearly every person in the room. Because her silence held weight. It forced people to fill in the blanks. It forced them to question their instincts. And more importantly, it forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth that maybe, just maybe, they were wrong. She adjusted her sleeve slightly. The movement was small, barely noticeable. But the way her fingers gently brushed the fabric, almost like a salute to something invisible, hinted at memories buried far from this place. No one could see it, but in that touch was a battlefield, a call sign, a name whispered on a dying breath. And still, she said nothing. She didn't need to. The room was thick with conversation, but none of it friendly. The kind of talk that hovers just below the surface, not quite loud enough to be called confrontation, but sharp enough to cut. It had started as subtle glances, then shifted into whispers. Now it was building into something uglier. Words like poser, fraud, and stolen valor drifted from group to group like smoke spreading from a slow fire. A man near the refreshments table, a retired Marine based on the distinct gait of his walk, was the first to say it aloud. "She's faking it. That uniform's a disgrace." He didn't lower his voice. In fact, he said it as though he wanted her to hear. But she didn't flinch. She remained seated, unmoved, as if she'd already endured worse in places these people had only read about in dusty textbooks. A pair of mid-ranking officers turned their heads at the sound of his accusation, exchanged glances, and nodded slightly. They didn't challenge him. They didn't question the assumption. Instead, they looked at the woman in the worn uniform as though the accusation confirmed something they were already thinking. It spread easily, the idea that she was an imposter, an attention seeker trying to play dress-up in a room full of real warriors. One of them stepped aside and whispered to a woman in a dress uniform, "It's probably for sympathy. Some people just love playing hero. That thing she's wearing? It's not even updated to current specs." The woman didn't disagree. She just tilted her head slightly and murmured, "Who lets themselves show up like that, though? At an event like this?" It wasn't just the uniform anymore, it was the silence, the way she held herself. The longer she said nothing, the more room they had to build their stories. Someone somewhere said she was a janitor who found a uniform in a surplus bin. Another claimed she was probably here to make some political statement, each version growing wilder than the last. And still, she said nothing. A younger soldier, barely into his 20s, stared at her for a moment, then shook his head and said with mock disappointment, "I've seen cleaner uniforms at Halloween parties." The ones around him chuckled, a few adding their own jokes. But underneath the laughter was discomfort because nothing about her posture said she was pretending. Then came the suggestion to remove her. Quiet at first, like a nervous cough from the back of the room. But it grew. A lieutenant stood near the registration table and whispered to a volunteer, "I think someone should ask her to verify her credentials. I mean, for all we know, she could be mentally unstable." The volunteer hesitated, glanced at the woman in question, and lowered his voice. "Are you sure? She's not doing anything." The lieutenant gave a cold smile. "Exactly. That's the problem." The phrase stolen valor now had momentum. It passed from one conversation to the next, gaining weight with every retelling. A retired Air Force pilot frowned and muttered to his companion, "She's got no business wearing that patch. That unit was decommissioned years ago. No one from that squad would be walking around in that relic. And certainly not like that." But they didn't know. They didn't ask. They assumed. And in their need to protect what they thought was sacred, they began tearing down someone who had yet to utter a single word. One man, older than most in the room, approached her slowly. His face wasn't angry, just puzzled. He stopped a few feet from where she sat, looked her over carefully, and opened his mouth to speak. But then something in her eyes, just for a second, made him close it again. He stood there, silent, then turned and walked away. That brief moment made others uncomfortable. They watched him walk off and wondered what he saw that they didn't. Someone near the door muttered, "She probably memorized some old unit name to make it sound legit. Google can do wonders these days." Another man, sipping from a small plastic cup, said with a smirk, "If she served, I'm the Queen of England." The words continued to roll, now with authority behind them. No proof, no facts, just the collective confidence of a room convinced it had already solved the mystery. Because it was easier to ridicule than to reconsider. Easier to dismiss than to ask. Easier to believe a lie than confront a truth that might make them feel shame for their assumptions. The air in the hall shifted the moment the doors opened again. A hush spread like ripples across still water. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence, phones were subtly tucked away, and even the most smug expressions faltered. The man who stepped in wore authority like a second skin. Polished boots, gleaming badges, and the distinct star on each shoulder, he didn't have to speak to command attention. He was a Brigadier General. Not a guest, not a speaker. A symbol of rank, history, and judgment. The kind of man whose presence rewrote the atmosphere in any room. He walked with precision, not fast but purposeful, his eyes scanning the crowd like a silent audit. Every movement was disciplined, economical. His gaze brushed over each row, pausing briefly on familiar faces, acknowledging a few nods, offering none in return. He wasn't here to socialize. His mission, whatever it was, hadn't yet revealed itself. But everyone could feel that something was about to shift. He passed by several guests, some of whom straightened up reflexively. Younger officers stood taller, medals conveniently adjusted, jackets smoothed out. The room had turned from petty murmuring to reverent attention, as if remembering where they were and who they claimed to be. Even those who had been snickering minutes earlier now watched the general with nervous smiles and folded arms. And then he saw her. She hadn't moved. Still seated where she'd been since the beginning. Still silent. Still draped in the same weathered uniform that had caused so much noise. If she noticed the change in atmosphere, she didn't show it. But the general noticed her instantly. His eyes locked on her like a long-lost thread pulled tight after years of unraveling. He didn't look confused. He didn't look skeptical. He looked focused, as if everything else in the room had faded to a blur. He stopped walking. Everyone around him took notice. A few eyebrows raised. People shifted in their seats, watching to see where he would go. Surely, they thought, he'd make his way to the front, to the podium, to the honored guests, to the center of attention where men of his rank typically belonged. But he didn't. He changed direction. Without a word, he made his way toward her, through rows of polished shoes and pressed uniforms, through a crowd that had spent the last hour dissecting her presence like a problem to be solved. Eyes followed him with growing confusion. Some even looked at each other in disbelief, as if trying to silently confirm, is he really going over there? But he was. His boots thudded softly across the floor as he approached her row. Every step sounded louder than the last, like a heartbeat building in the silence. He stopped just in front of her. She still didn't look up. She didn't need to. His presence was unmistakable. The general stood there for a moment, studying her. Not judging, assessing. The kind of look you give when something buried in memory resurfaces with startling clarity. Then he lowered his eyes slightly toward her shoulder, toward the patch nearly erased by time. The unit tag. He leaned in just enough to read it. A beat passed, and then his face changed. It wasn't dramatic. No gasp. No exclamation. But those watching closely saw the breath he drew in, saw the subtle parting of his lips, saw the recognition flood across features usually carved from stone. Whatever he saw in that tag, it wasn't trivial. It wasn't routine. It was something real, something heavy, something that didn't belong to bedtime stories or unit folklore. It was history, personal, painful, and almost forgotten. A few people behind him craned their necks to see what he was looking at. They saw nothing but a patch of fabric faded beyond legibility. But he saw more. He saw through the wear, through the layers of dust and memory to something that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. Something classified, maybe? Or buried by time. He straightened slowly, eyes not leaving her shoulder. The room had fallen into a tense, wordless stillness. All the whispers had died. Every person in the room who had doubted her, mocked her, dismissed her, now watched a general halt his own mission to examine a scrap of fabric on the arm of a woman they had laughed at. And the look on his face said more than any speech ever could. For a moment, no one breathed. The Brigadier General's silence after reading the patch echoed louder than any accusation that had filled the room earlier. He didn't salute, he didn't speak, but his expression said everything. His eyes, once sharp with duty, had softened not in pity but in recognition. Not of the woman, perhaps, but of what that unit tag meant. A recognition laced with a quiet reverence. A silent salute passed between warriors who had seen the same shadows. The people nearby leaned forward, trying to understand what had just happened. Some squinted to read the patch for themselves, but it was too faded, too worn by time. The threads were dull, edges nearly torn. The letters, if they ever had meaning to these spectators, were now no more than cryptic stitching. But the general had seen it, and whatever he saw changed everything. He gave a subtle nod. Then he stepped back, not out of distance, but out of respect. The crowd didn't know how to react. For nearly an hour, they had talked over each other, pointing fingers without evidence, assuming stories without facts. Now they sat in silence, watching a man of the highest authority stand before the woman they had mocked. His body language humble, deferential even. A few of the younger soldiers began to glance at each other with furrowed brows. The whispers stopped not because they were finished, but because the room had shifted out of their control. Someone whispered, "What does it say?" Another responded, "I couldn't see, just numbers." Maybe a code name? A veteran sitting in the back narrowed his eyes. He wasn't saying anything either, but he was thinking. The kind of thinking that happens when puzzle pieces begin to shift, forming a picture he hadn't realized he knew. The general gave her one last look before turning toward the center of the hall. He walked slowly, as if letting his steps absorb what he had just seen. His shoulders didn't slump, but something in his movements had changed, as though he'd just been reminded of something, someone that hadn't crossed his mind in years. People began whispering again, but this time with caution. There was no laughter, no sarcasm, only questions. "What unit was that? I've never seen that patch before. That tag, it looked handmade." The truth was, most of them had never served long enough or deep enough to recognize the designation. Some had served in supply. Some had stood posts. A few had seen combat, but none at the level that left you classified and erased. But for those few who had danced with the shadow side of service, that tag, those numbers, meant something. In the third row, an older woman adjusted her glasses. She'd served 20 years, mostly in intelligence, and even she only knew fragments. But now, seeing the general's reaction, she knew. Not the full story, but enough to realize she'd misjudged the figure in the worn-out uniform. The general finally reached the podium and paused, letting his eyes pass slowly over the crowd. There was tension now, but not from disdain. From shame. From the sting of hindsight. From the recognition that someone had been seen not for who she was, but for who they assumed she wasn't. Near the back, one of the younger cadets whispered, "Why would someone with a tag like that just sit in silence like that?" An older man answered without turning, "Because she doesn't need to speak. That patch speaks louder than any of us ever could." It was true. In a hall full of polished ribbons and speech-ready officers, she had sat alone, in silence, letting a fading patch on her arm carry the burden of proof. And when the right eyes finally looked, they didn't see fabric. They saw legacy. A legacy not written in ceremony or textbooks, but in classified logs, hidden missions, forgotten conflicts. Now people looked at her differently. Their posture changed. Their eyes dropped, not out of shame, but out of humility. The mockery that had filled the room earlier now hung over it like a fog, dense with guilt. No one dared approach her just yet, not because she was unapproachable, but because they were unsure how to make up for what had already been done. And still she sat, calm, quiet, her expression unreadable, her hands folded. The tag on her arm remained untouched but no longer unseen. The silence that had overtaken the hall lingered, but it was no longer the silence of suspicion. It had shifted into reverence. The very same people who had, not long ago, whispered and laughed, now sat in uncomfortable stillness, processing the weight of what they had just witnessed. Every mocking smirk had been wiped clean. Every careless comment now echoed in the minds of those who spoke them, exposed under the quiet gravity of recognition. No one knew exactly what unit that tag belonged to, but it didn't matter anymore. The Brigadier General had seen it, and his reaction had redefined everything. The woman still hadn't moved. Her posture was unchanged. Her expression remained neutral, maybe unreadable, but there was something subtly different now. Not in her, but in how others perceived her. She no longer looked out of place. She looked timeless, carved into the space she'd never needed to defend. Her uniform hadn't changed, nor had the faded metals or the fraying seams, but now they carried weight, meaning, proof. A ripple of uneasy shifting passed through the crowd. A few of the younger servicemen tried to avoid eye contact, pretending to focus on their name tags, their programs, anything to distract themselves from the realization settling in their chest. Their laughter from earlier seemed so juvenile now, so shallow. The image of the Brigadier General pausing in front of her, looking at that tag like he was standing before a monument, had embedded itself into their memory like a scar. One by one, conversations began again, but quieter this time, softer. People weren't whispering to insult anymore. They were asking, guessing, trying to piece together what they just witnessed. She has to be from a ghost unit, someone said under their breath. Special ops, maybe? Old school black ops. That tag didn't look standard. A retired Navy commander leaned forward to someone beside him and murmured, that tag's not just rare, it's buried. I haven't seen those numbers since the Balkan campaigns. That unit was supposed to be wiped off the books. No one doubted her now. Not because she had proven anything herself, but because someone who outranked them all had done it for her. And he hadn't used his words, he'd used silence. A glance. A recognition so heavy that it had made the entire hall recalibrate. She sat in the same seat, but the room now circled her like gravity had shifted around her presence. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that commanded it. A woman in a high-ranking administrative uniform who had earlier voiced suspicion now looked visibly uncomfortable. She adjusted her collar, folded and refolded her program, and finally leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "We misjudged her." "Badly." Her colleague nodded but said nothing. One of the younger officers, one of the same who had mocked her boots and her medals, stood slowly. He didn't approach her, he just stood as if standing alone would somehow unburden the guilt weighing on his chest. But even that small act drew a few glances. Some understood it. Some mirrored it. Near the back, an old soldier wiped his eyes. Not because he was sad, but because something about her presence, about the way she had sat, unwavering and unshaken, had pulled something buried from deep inside. A memory, perhaps. A name from long ago. A face. A mission no one had ever spoken about again. Respect, the kind that couldn't be taught, had filled the air like incense. You couldn't see it, couldn't hold it, but you felt it with every breath. The room was no longer filled with peers, officers, and civilians, it was filled with witnesses. Witnesses to the danger of assumptions, to the power of stillness, to the strength of a legacy that required no introduction. Someone in the front row finally whispered what others had been thinking. She never needed to say a word. We said everything for her and we were wrong. Others nodded slowly, the realization spreading. It wasn't just about a patch. It wasn't just about the general's recognition. It was about what her silence had revealed about them. How quickly they had doubted. How easily they had chosen mockery over curiosity. Her silence had shown them a mirror. And now they sat looking into it. The patch that no one had recognized an hour ago now felt iconic. The very threads that had been mocked were now sacred. No one dared touch that shoulder, but everyone looked toward it with newfound understanding. Some with admiration, some with remorse, all with respect.